Once a president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, said, Africa's history has been written by others. We need to own our problems and solutions and write our story. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, today I am Nazmul talking on natural civilization, the fourth episode on Kenya, the important country and the geopolitical, geoeconomic locations in Africa, especially in Horn of Africa. Today we will talk with Mr. Nazmul Israel, who has himself finished his bachelor and master's degree on political science and international relations. He graduated his degree from Middle East Technical University and Ankara Yildirim Beyazıt University. He himself has a focus on Africa, especially on Horn of Africa, and he himself is a citizen of Kenya. Mr. Nazmul Israel, welcome to our program at Natural Civilization Natural TV. It's really great program, and you are now talk on Kenya, and this is the real fourth episode that we are talking on Kenya, and we feel like the Kenya is the gate of Africa. I personally really thank you so much to come to our episode and to talk on your country and also the importance of Horn of Africa and the position of Kenya in Africa and the importance of Africa in the world politics and in world economy. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting me, Nazmul.
Yeah, you're welcome. Before going to our discussion, I just want to ask you, Mr. Israel, you are focusing on Africa, you are focusing on African politics, African conflict resolution, African civil society, non-economic factors of Africa, administrative and bureaucratic issues of Africa. So you have a huge experience. You are also a researcher and working as a researcher in Turkey. So could you please tell us about your country like Kenya from the historical and the civilizational roots of Kenya in Africa and also in global geographical position?
Thank you, Nazmul. Kenya is found in East Africa. It's considered to be the political and economic hub, and some people also add that it's also the technological hub, not just of East Africa, but also of East and Central Africa. It got independence in 1964 from the British, and since then it has had its fair share of challenges, most of which the society and the government together have attempted to solve, and a number of initiatives and programs have been introduced to try and overcome some of the challenges that the country found itself upon independence.
So, for example, like from independence, even also the current situation or the current position of Kenya, could you please tell us, like, before to go to the political development or the socio-economic development of Kenya, but I think our viewers also like these things, the civilization roots of Kenya, like how Kenya came to the world. I mean, as an independent of Kenya, or if there is any architectural place of Kenya that represent Kenya to the world. Could you please tell us?
Before the coming of Europeans, Kenya, in particular the coast of the Horn of Africa, was already interacting significantly with the rest of the world. The Chinese, for example, had significant trade relations with the Horn of Africa over 300 years before the coming of Europeans. Indian traders and merchants are moving from the subcontinent of India to Africa through the Horn of Africa, and therefore the Kenyan coast was a pretty significant region or gateway for these external actors. But more importantly were the Arabs. Arab traders had significant contact with the Kenyan people long before the coming of Europeans. In fact, long before the arrival of Europeans, the Arabs had already introduced Islam in the coastal province of Mombasa and Zanzibar, which are almost in the same geographical region. In addition, their interaction actually led to the outcome of the now famous language Swahili, which is a product of intermarriage between the Arabs and the Bantus living in the Horn of Africa. So Kenya in particular is not a new country when it comes to international politics and economics. It had a fair share of engagement with the rest of the world for a long time, and the coming of European then put the icing on the cake, led to colonialism, and in 1964, when the country got independence, then it has tried to solidify its national identity.
So it shows like the Kenya, they have a really, I mean, great looking or good looking from Asia to Europe, Europe to West, West to again Middle East. I mean, like it shows the importance, geopolitical and geo-economic importance of Kenya. But before this, to go to the deep discussion of Kenya's geopolitical and geo-economic more importance in the region of Horn of Africa and also Middle East, I want to ask you one thing, like why actually Kenya is very famous for? I mean, because in some extent we learned that Kenya is famous for the safari park, famous for the you know, like so many park, national park. Kenya's national park is really famous in the world. Kenya have so many things to say to the world, like it's famous for this reason. Could you please explain us, like, okay, these things is Kenya is really famous?
Kenya has had its footprint in global arena in a number of areas. First of all, the Kenyan coffee and tea are some of the most famous brands across Europe and in the Middle East. The Kenyan flowers in particular, if you look at its export to Europe, Kenyan flowers occupy about 30% of the European market, and about 90% of all flowers imported to the Arab Emirates come from Kenya. I remember that Arab Emirates then export these flowers to about 20 to 30 countries. So apart from the agricultural products, Kenyan athletes are quite famous. Kenya holds a number of world records in athletics, particularly in the 1,500 meters, the 3,000 meters, 5,000 meters, 10,000 meters, and the 42 kilometers marathon is dominated by Kenyans. And of course, the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, also traces his roots to Kenya.
Exactly.
And these are things that
that's what we will also go actually to discuss the Kenyan diaspora in global area. But the things we already know, the history, the civilization, you already tell very greatly. I mean, the fact and the contextual fact of Kenya from independence and before the independence and the current situation, why Kenya is famous, and why Kenya was famous and now famous, and the future scenario of the Kenya by your talking. But based on your topic, we understand that Kenya's importance geopolitically and geoeconomically, especially the position in Horn of Africa, from the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb to the Strait of Hormuz, and the whole scenario from the Arab Sea to the Indian Ocean. It shows the current political scenario, like the uprising countries from Asia like China and India. On the other hand, the Middle East politics, I mean Middle East politics means Middle East conflict, and as I know you are also focusing those kind of steps. So how you explain the whole of the things from the background, not only Kenya but also the Horn of African countries like Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, like how you see those kind of stuffs from the world scenarios or like the world's development?
Kenya, perhaps we can describe it as one of the countries that has firmly held the principle of Pan-Africanism and non-alignment principles that were developed during the colonial struggles. Indeed, Kenya has a solid relationship with many countries in the world. It is having a solid relationship with the United States. It has a sound relationship with the Chinese. India has a significantly important
so you mean like they're making actually great balanced politics with
yes, Kenya has and I think this can be seen in a number of factors. Kenya, for example, hosts the United Nations Environmental Program. This shows that even the global community understands the significance of Kenya. The world headquarters of the United Nations Environmental Program, as well as other significant international organizations, are actually headquartered in Kenya. The United Nations Office of Nairobi is almost the engine of United Nations activities both in Africa and in the Middle East. We have major organizations such as the FAO, the Agricultural Organization of the World, which is having a regional office in Kenya, and the number of embassies also that are positioned in Kenya are quite huge if you compare it to other neighboring countries. So the importance of Kenya in terms of being a neutral player in the region has attracted sufficient interaction both with states and also with international organizations.
So, Mr. Israel, you really clearly gives so many argument and statement the importance of Kenya in global politics and how they are giving and making their neutral position to make sustainable relations with the world political and superpower countries or great power countries. In one hand, they are making good relations with the United States. In another hand, they are making good relations with like China or India. But the fact is, like, you know, the world is moving and world order is moving. Now we are seeing that the China is approaching in Africa, especially through the West, East, and the South Africa, those kind of areas. So how do you see this kind of issue, that the Chinese approaches in Africa? How, in your opinion, how you want to argue on this fact that Chinese approaches in compare with the what we see in previously Western approaches in Africa?
The Chinese arrival in Africa has elicited mixed reaction from a number of stakeholders. There are people who believe that the Chinese are heaven sent, if I can use the words of the former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, who described the Chinese as coming from heaven to perhaps rescue a continent that was in their need of both financial and political support. But there's those who are a bit skeptical about the presence of the Chinese in the continent. They argue that while the Chinese have packaged their approach to Africa in what seems to be different from the Western approaches, the similarities and differences are quite thin. There is no clear-cut difference in terms of what the Chinese approach and what the Western approach was. But that then shadows the question about what is the place of African countries in the whole idea or interaction with external actors. Because if we talk about the Chinese approach to Africa and the Western approach to Africa, then many people will ask the question, what is the Kenyan approach to the Chinese, or what is the African approach then to the Chinese? This side of the coin has for many years been taken for granted. Many people tend to define the global politics from the big power concept, where they only look at, we have the Chinese here, we have the Western countries here, and they tend to ignore the position, the interest, the objective of African countries, and that is a big mistake. One thing that I can put for sure is that over the years, Africans have slowly but certainly learned the craft of international politics.
Well, exactly.
Some of the good brains that are making decisions on behalf of the continent are coming up with strategies that do benefit the continent, and you'll not be surprised if at the end of the day the continent actually evolves and become a much more competitive region.
With the world politics, they are also evolving, and you understand what is going on in the world.
More interestingly is the fact that their evolution has been taken for granted significantly. We know that in the last 2 decades, 3 decades, African countries have lifted millions out of poverty. If it were in India or in China, then it did make a lot of news that China is on the takeoff. The number of African people, household, I can say.
I just want to include one sentence, you know, like most of the time when we are see most of the international media, even the big budgeted international media, they're focusing on, they're showing to Africa like a poverty based on poor or those kind of stuff like drought, desertification. Africa is totally conflict area. Like we actually introduced with Africa like this way. But the reality is totally different. That's what also you are also trying to explain. You are explaining those issues.
Yes, what I'm trying to emphasize on is that the continent of Africa has had its fair share of challenges over the years, and people have learned from these challenges. The assumption that the continent is static, that it is not moving, that it is only the big powers that are moving, and that the big powers that have approaches and interest is actually mistaken. And that's why we talk about the reviving of the African Union as an institution, but not just the African Union as an institution, but even regional powers. For example, the IGAD, which is the intergovernmental authority found in the Horn of Africa, has managed many of African challenges, including the South Sudan conflict, which was solved thanks to intervention of IGAD. We know that ECOWAS also intervened in the Gambian case when there was a small crisis under Yahya Jammeh and solve the problem. And nobody talks about these significant
good approaches. That's what Africa did.
Yes, so these approaches towards giving African solution to African problems is
by
growing.
Africans.
Yes, it's just that sometimes the problems are overwhelming, and the steps that are being taken are also not publicized well, but we can definitely say that the continent is in a trajectory that has never been before. If you compare what it was 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, it's a totally different region, and going forward we expect that significant transformations will be experienced. And just to add that if you look at the continent today in terms of education, literacy levels, which means development in human capital has increased significantly, and development of human capital or transformation of the population to become productive entities and part of the production process is what has spurred development in countries like India and China, as well as South Korea. So people may take for granted that more Africans are now enrolling in schools, the more Africans are now getting university education. These are the kind of steps that are basic and needed in 21st century for any country to take off to a now more serious development trajectory.
So you went India last year, and you are the fellow of Cotillo Leadership. And could you please explain like the Indian diaspora and Indian approaches towards Africa, especially like Kenya-centric area? I mean the Eastern Africa, like Horn of Africa, those countries. How India sees Africa?
Indian involvement in Africa, as I mentioned before, predates the colonial era. But during the colonial era, there was significant movement of Indians from the British colonial Indian trust to British colonial regions. For example, in 1900, during the construction of the Kenya-Uganda Railway by the British, a lot of Indian worksmen actually were brought in to work in the Kenya-Uganda Railway. You know that people like Mahatma Gandhi actually spent a significant time of his life in South Africa. Today, around 1 million Indians are in Africa. But when you talk about the Indian diaspora, and this is actually something that African countries need to learn from, by 1947, when India had just become independent, the first objective of the Indian Foreign Ministry was to identify where the Indian diaspora were located, to find out their economic status, their level of education, their political views, and family status. And these are the Indian diaspora who then later have not just strengthened relations between India and the countries where Indian diaspora are, but they have made significant investment back in India. I am made to believe that even the Indian military technology and space research is actually benefiting a lot from Indians who come from the diaspora. And therefore, when we talk about the Indian diaspora, there is a lot African countries can learn from in terms of how to tap into the diaspora potential and make sure that then investment, human resource capital, and even political support, the diaspora can play an important role in building bridges between countries going forward.
Okay, this shows like that you are try to really greatly explain that fact, like the Chinese approach in one hand, and on the other hand the Indian approaches. But we know this in world politics they have so many competition. But when it comes to the Africa, it shows that it's a win-win situation. Africa is going to also benefited by them. I mean, like Africa is going to benefit from their approaches, and Africa is learning, and Africa is already experienced. I mean, they have so many challenges, but it shows that Africa is make their position, especially like you country Kenya, they also make their position. The Horn of African country, they make their position. It already clear like this Africa, the Kenyans position or importance, or the Africans importance, or those kind of stuff. But as we know, like the Kenya and the neighborhood countries of Kenya, like there is so many conflicting fact, like Al-Shabaab or those kind of conflicting issue. So how do you think that this kind of threatening party, is it really challenging for Kenyan's economy? And also, I just want to ask you to include with this question, like what actually are the non-economic factors for Kenyan development? Like just try to focus on the challenges and the non-economic factors. That's actually rather than economic factor.
Well, again, this is an important question that may lead to a lot of controversy. But just to mention that sometimes conflict in one part of the world leads to benefit to the other part of the world in terms of investment that could have gone to other countries which are now facing conflict can actually then be diverted back to the country that is experiencing relative peace. There are many people who have talked about piracy money from Somalia being invested in neighboring countries. This can spur economic development, but whether they are the moral sources of capital then remains to be debatable. The threat of organized crime, and in this case human trafficking, terrorism, corruption, of course threatens any society's potential to grow and realize its capability. And that's why the Kenyan government, during its intervention in Somalia in 2011, was founded based on this question as to whether Al-Shabaab was threatening Kenya's prosperity. And the government of Kenya thought that yes, the presence of this group in the neighboring country threatens the potential of Kenya to continue to grow, and therefore it saw the necessity of intervening and try to come up with methods of defeating the terrorist group, which has again over the time proved to be very difficult indeed. So as just like any other war against terrorism today is quite difficult to defeat terrorist organizations. So Kenya has responded to possible threats. Remember that Kenya was part of the global intervention, the war against piracy. In fact, just to mention that Kenya is the only country in the world where pirates from all over the world have actually been tried in the Kenyan courts and being held in Kenyan jails, a responsibility that the Security Council actually passed. So its involvement is both militarily but also in terms of legal responsibility. It's trying its best to make sure that the region can have much more conducive environment so that investors can be attracted. Remember that kidnappings of foreigners, even inside Kenyan territory, threatens anybody who comes to Kenya, and the several attacks by terrorist groups believed to be coming from the other side of the border does threaten possibility of people to invest, and the government of Kenya has tried to respond appropriately on this issue.
So it shows like that the Kenya, they have a challenges, but they are trying to overcome those kind of challenges. But by the way, you were also the Turkish scholar, I mean the holder and fellow of Turkish government scholarship, and you have also so many articles, academic articles on Turkey, African relations, Turkey, Horn of African relation, Turkish approaches in Somalia, Turkish approaches in Kenya, or those kind of stuffs. So could you please tell us, like, is really Turkey will be the factor for Africa in compare with their other international political economic country like China, India, or how we can say the US or European Union? How do you see the Turkish approaches or Turkish soft power in Africa, especially in Horn of Africa?
Well, geopolitical factors or scholars argue that there will never be a vacuum in any region. So a country probably may not find a vacant place to spread its influence, and therefore it comes down to the strategies that a country employs when it's approaching its foreign relations. And that's where the point about soft power actually comes from. Turkey enjoys massive soft power capabilities that it has deployed in the continent, from the scholarships to its humanitarian activities in a number of countries, and even within the international organization, it has put it very clear that it stands with countries from Africa and other countries considered to be from the south. So definitely there will be steep competition. Countries that Turkey is competing with in Africa, India, China, Japan and South Korea, will also adjust their foreign policy strategies in the event that they are losing influence. So it's not just about Turkey's strategies towards Africa, but how do countries that are already in Africa, and also those ones which are looking at the continent.
Like some academic articles argue like this way, that Turkish humanitarian activities in Africa, some specific countries or like a whole Africa, it gives so much trustable position for Turkey to work with African countries or African peoples. Like, how do you argue with this statement? I mean, do you see the Turkish humanitarian approach is a really gate of Turkey to enter in Africa?
Of course, the issue of trust is fundamental when it comes to building foreign relations. One of them is that past engagements, how we have related with you in the past, forms the foundation on how we will engage with each other in the future. Turkey not being a colonial power, at least in Africa, means that many African countries...
Many Africa has experience.
Yes, like therefore, the level of trust between African countries and Turkey is different from that one of other non-African or non-Asian countries. So based on this, I can argue that indeed the historical and economic or humanitarian engagement between the Turkish government and countries in Africa is founded on a solid ground and is destined for great things in the future.
Like the couple of days ago, the Foreign Policy wrote one article that Kenya political economic tensions with ethnic phase, it creates some regional and economic inequalities. So it shows that Kenya is facing so many inequalities in terms of their economy. How do you see this? That this kind of stuff, like, it's a really challenging thing. Do there any resolution or maybe a solve you are seeing from your based?
Identity as a concept plays an important role in many societies. It plays an important role on how much a community or society will gain from the government, and this not just in Kenya or in Africa, but in many parts of the world. Identity based on clan or ethnicity, religion, in many cases influences a community or a group's position in the countries in terms of what they get from the national cake. And in Kenya, it's not any different. People gather around social configurations in order to lobby or to pursue their interest in the country, be it political or economic. And the outcome is sometimes not what anybody would want to see, inequality and conflict at the end of the day.
By the way, India, whatever the challenge is actually same for every country. You know, whatever the countries, they are facing the same problem in the world capitalist system or the capitalist economy. There's that one side argument. There will be the another side argument. But the last, because we are going to finish our discussion. So before finishing the discussion, I want to ask you two questions. The one is the Kenyan diaspora in abroad, like Kenya. They are Kenyans people, Kenyans students. They have a really potentiality, and they shows their diaspora and potentiality to the abroad. So how do you see, I mean, these diaspora, I mean, Kenya's diaspora in abroad, in global? This is the first. And the second question is what's your opinion and how do you want to see your country, Kenya, in future?
The role of diaspora, as I've mentioned, even though African countries have not fully tapped on the potential of the diaspora, remember that Africans in the diaspora still send more money than any the rest of the world combined, and the much publicized foreign aid to Africa is actually dwarfed by the amount of money Africans working and studying abroad send back to the continent. So the figures are clear that their contribution to economic growth, there is a strong attachment by the diaspora to the continent. But this might be a different set of diaspora which is a first generation diaspora where somebody was born in Africa and then managed to travel abroad. The ones who have been born abroad and raised there, probably third or fourth generations, might probably or not have a very strong attachment to the continent. And that's why when in the 1840s, when people like Marcus Garvey, William Sylvester, and Webb Du Bois came up with a Pan-African movement in the United States and later in the United Kingdom, it was about unifying people of African descent. Remember, we have a huge diaspora in Brazil, 40%. I mean, one person out of four, or 4 people out of 10 Brazilians actually has an origin from Africa. In the United States, in Europe, in different parts of the world. Even
I think that himself, Barack Obama, he was the Kenyan roots. I mean,
of course,
in
yes.
one hand, you can show. I mean, we can say that the Kenya is providing or making leader or president in other country.
Oh, of course, many Kenyans are involved in major global initiatives, such as many Kenyans working in NASA. Many of them have participated in. For other countries in global sports, you can find a Kenyan or two in different
Exactly, that's what else I'm just following, yes. This Kenyans marathon and the runner. Even I find out the one question, that why Kenyans is getting so much Olympic gold in a runner-up. Yeah. That's true. That the last one that I asked you. Like
the future of Kenya, I think that the answer is simple: work. Kenyans are very resilient men and women. It's a country that has been able to produce quite outstanding and competitive individuals. I think they are also quick learners. They are able to learn quickly from their mistakes and pull back and try to find the correct route. So the events that happened last year following the political agreement between the major stakeholders in the country political arena set the stage for the country's future. But I will tell you for a fact that going forward, Kenya will be a competitive technological hub, not just in East Africa, but even in the Middle East and Africa as a continent. The completion of the much anticipated Konza City, which will be a replica of the Silicon Savannah, currently going on and has received major investment, for example, from the Korean Institute of Science and Technology, which is now establishing the main anchor, the Kenya Institute of Science and Technology, a graduate technology school at the park, as well as other investors such as Nokia, HP. Going forward, once the project will be completed, we will not be talking about the Kenyan tea, but we'll be talking about the Kenyan technology. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really great. And we believe also like in future, we will see the one more influential and more effective person from based on Kenya. You, Nader Israel, believe it. And thank you so much to come in our program.
Thank you.
And to say the very important things and very good information and hidden information. That's what actually people doesn't know. That's what we are not seeing. We are not talking in international media or in our as usual topic. So really great information. We really thank you so much to come in our program at Natural Civilization. Thank you, our viewers, to be with us and to watch our program. And we will see you in our next episode in Natural Civilization at Natural TV. Thank you.